Hi, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to talk about chassis types. There's a long history of ambulances, of course. We've seen many different evolutions of different type chassis that have been utilized to provide EMS. All the way back to the horse-drawn carriage, working through to what was thought to be an optimal design at one point was a station wagon type ambulance that resembled a hearse. Of course, then we started to see more modular type vehicles develop. You can see an early version of that here, and of course now we've seen many organizations move to medium or larger chassis trucks or vehicles. We still have the same three types of ambulances that you probably learned in basic EMT class. Type 1, where we actually have a disjuncture between the modular, the chassis, if you will, and the modular box on the back. Type 2, which is more of a van type ambulance, and a Type 3, which actually has some type of access between the front vehicular chassis and the modular box. And most people have a preference to these. I think historically, I've always really liked and been biased towards Type 1 ambulances because they're a little easier to work on without what resembled a van or short front end to the engine compartment of the vehicle. There's not as much mobility with that type of ambulance between the front and the back, but it also provides some security between the front and back also. And then later, I haven't had much opportunity to work in a Type 2 ambulance, but after spending some time in the air medical industry, I really could see the benefits of a smaller ambulance. Normally people think they need more space and more ability to move around, but unfortunately that actually increases the risk, and it increases the safety risk to you as a provider. In a Type 2 ambulance, you're much closer to the patient. You can stay seated for doing most of the procedures that you need to do for a patient. So there may be some safety benefits to that. And we're actually starting to see smaller vehicles come about in new types. And I'll show you a picture of one of those here in a second. Light chassis vehicles, of course, that you see here. We have the medium chassis. A lot of people have moved to those. We'll talk about some of the benefits and challenges with both. But here you see the new Braun ambulance, and it's somewhat a combination between a Type 3 and a van, in that it's much narrower than many of the larger modular units that you see. Definitely some benefits between the different types. When you think about a light chassis vehicle, somewhere between 100 and 150,000 miles, depending on how well you maintain the vehicle through preventive maintenance. Some people, though, have gotten as much as 250,000 miles out of light chassis vehicles. But that's with exceptional preventive maintenance programs where they're continuously replacing parts. And even in those situations, to get that many miles, about 30% of the time the vehicle is actually down in some manner for maintenance, preventive maintenance activities taking place. So that's a consideration, because that could increase the number of vehicles that are required for you to be able to deliver the service that you figured out last week as part of the deployment work that we did last week. In terms of years of life, really depending on the mileage, really depending on the terrain that the vehicle's operating in, somewhere between 2 and 7 years, depending again on the number of miles that you're putting on the vehicle in a given period of time. And again, the life can be extremely extended with an aggressive preventive maintenance program, and we'll talk about some of the things you may want to do to try to put a program such as that in place. Medium chassis trucks, 200 to 275,000 miles. Some people have maintained these vehicles up to 400,000 miles as kind of backup vehicles. But usually when they get to about 250, 275,000, you have a lot of repairs taking place. So you probably don't wish for that to be a frontline vehicle. The other thing, and again, this is anecdotal, there's very little in terms of literature that's been collected. So this is definitely an area that deserves some research. But historically, my anecdotal experience is that the maintenance on the medium chassis vehicles is much greater in terms of the quantity that's required than the light chassis vehicles. Now, that is kind of contrary to what we just saw on the slides, because in the slides I said the vehicles won't last quite as long, some of the parts will last longer. It just seems to me that the medium chassis vehicles require more smaller things on a more routine basis. So if you're going to utilize a medium chassis truck, you should plan for that and make sure it's part of that maintenance system. Now, another one of the issues that comes into play with the medium chassis vehicles is who will actually be able to do the repair. And we'll spend some time talking about that also. But again, some of the parts in the medium chassis vehicles definitely will last longer. The transmissions, the differentials, the whole drive chain is going to last a whole lot longer because there's less work placed on it in a given period of time than the smaller vehicles. Brakes are going to last longer. So those are things to keep in mind. Now, when you think about the right size of your fleet, the thing to remember is it's going to be a stair step. And it's going to stair step in conjunction with the increase in volume that you have, that you will analyze over time by doing demand analysis. So you'll see something like the representation at the bottom right of the slide that kind of shows a stair step over time. A vehicle will actually provide a certain number of transports, so you'll see a pretty good growth in transports before the need for another vehicle. Same with crews. You may be able to add more resources, more capacity, more unit hours, depending on where those unit hours are added. Now, if you find that you have really large peaks in your system and you're needing to add more unit hours, of course that's going to require more vehicles to be able to do that in that given period of time. So all of these components are going to work together to actually help you determine what's the right size for your fleet. Look at what the break-even analysis looks like in terms of that, and we'll talk about that more. And the other thing is recognize sink costs. When we talk about sink costs, we'll talk about that more in the finance class, but sink cost basically is we've already invested funds at a certain level, and beyond that, there's no way to recoup those funds. So occasionally, you'll run into a situation where you won't include that, maybe salvage vehicles, or the salvage value of vehicles, or maybe the cost that you've already paid for a certain item or for facility, etc. But those things are considered a sink cost. They shouldn't be included as part of the decision-making process going forward. If there's a more economical way to run the system moving forward, then it doesn't make sense to actually include those as part of the decision-making process. We'll talk about that much more in the finance class. When you think about justifying vehicles, remember the objective. The objective is to meet your community's need in the most cost-effective manner as possible. So you need to be very clear about that need and then engage the fleet users to help you figure this out. In terms of fleet users, include not only the staff, but also the people that are going to be actually maintaining the vehicles. If that's internal personnel that you've hired that are going to be doing the preventive maintenance and maintaining the vehicles, they should be included. Or if it's outside resources that are going to be involved in doing that, I would involve them as well. You've got to think about the quantity and compare the cost and benefit of the different type vehicles. in terms of the number you need. Sometimes you may not be able to get the vehicles you would like simply because the cost prevents that. But in such cases, you've got to make sure that you have enough vehicles. So you've got to balance those two pieces. You also have to consider alternatives for meeting the need. Is there a way that you could do it with a different type vehicle in a certain locale? Now, depending on the system, that may not make a whole lot of sense because you're trying to utilize a certain vehicle in a certain part of the geographical area you cover, and it may not cross over well to the other use. But an example of where that might come into play is, consider if you're a hospital-based EMS system and you're doing both critical care and 911 and non-emergency transports. In that situation, you may be able to use vehicles across those different platforms, especially if you break them out. Now, if you do all of those functions in an integrated way, then your vehicles are going to have to be such that they actually will accommodate doing that. Now, it could be, though, that you have a special vehicle for a special situation. So instead of having every vehicle capable of taking care of bariatric patients, for example, you may have a special bariatric unit. Those are things to consider as part of your long-term strategy, and figure out how you can place those components, those needs, meet those needs over the long term. Then, of course, determine the most cost-effective way to meet those needs. And in that regard, are you going to purchase the vehicles or are you going to lease the vehicles? And we'll talk more about that. So when you're thinking about vehicles, think about creating something like you see here that says, here's the type of benefit that we'll get from a given vehicle. And then here's the potential cost per year in terms of saving versus use. So state those out, write them out, and actually evaluate it and see if it makes sense. Here's an example of kind of how that was done in terms of looking at take-home vehicles and the benefit of that in terms of the vehicles being available for the administrative staff to have the vehicle to respond automatically, what the cost would be, the increase in productivity, all of those factors. Figure those factors in. Do a detailed cost-benefit analysis and determine what your needs actually are. Again, in deciding which chassis, there's a lot of things that come into play. The size, the shape of the vehicles, the terrain, the number of miles that you drive. If it's less than 10 to 15 miles per transport or per run, per call, then you probably would consider a light chassis vehicle. Where on the other hand, if you're going more than 15 miles per call, you may consider a larger chassis vehicle simply because you want to carry more equipment. Think about the terrain. Are you in an unusual terrain? Medium chassis vehicles can be a challenge in really small rural communities sometimes because of the particular roads that you actually have for access. The same way they can be a challenge in very tight cities sometimes to move those large vehicles through those areas. So you need to think about those considerations and figure out what would actually work best in terms of the geography and the streets that you'll be covering. The other thing to think about, of course, that we mentioned earlier is equipment. If you need a vehicle that's large, that'll carry something like a newborn isolette, then you probably are going to need a larger vehicle, especially if that vehicle is designed to do that all the time. Also, if you're carrying things like extrication equipment, that equipment can be fairly heavy. That can be a real challenge to carry that on a light chassis vehicle that's not equipped for that. It can really put a lot of wear and tear on not only the brakes, but on the drive chain and the transmission, etc. So that's something to keep in mind. The other things to think about is the amount of vehicle that you can actually safely carry. You want to make sure that if you're in a rural area with very long transports, you want to make sure that the fuel tank is large enough. Patients, you may have family members, you may not allow family members. You may have to carry multiple patients. If you're in an inner city environment, it may be easy to call for a backup unit, where if you're in a rural community, I had the opportunity to work in Fairbanks, Alaska a few years ago, and a given run may last as much as it may be a 2-hour drive to the request for service. So the call, it may be, the total call may be 5 hours in length. So in that situation, they have no idea what they're going to encounter when they arrive at the scene. So in those situations, they need to be able to carry more than one patient. Again, if you're thinking about doing interfacility critical care transport, specialty care transport, those things usually require a larger vehicle, especially if you're doing really long trips, and you usually see that with those crews. So I'll stop there in terms of thinking about chassis, and we'll pick up talking about specifications in the next lecture.